Welcome to our presentation. Today we will discuss Latvia's economy, its current situation and trends. And first of all, Latvia is a small open economy that highly depends on the ECB and relies a lot on its exports. Also, Latvia is still recovering from the recession caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, and the Russian-Ukrainian conflict along with Europe's sanctions deepen some problems such as high inflation. Using this QR code you may find a detailed analysis with mathematical explanations. And now let's proceed.
Latvia is a small open economy country and is a fully fledged member of the European Union. Hence, its economic policies are dictated by guidelines of the European Central Bank. The crisis that began on February 24th worsened the initial pandemic-related economic downturn. Difficulties in Latvian-Russian trading relationship, the overall economic and geopolitical uncertainty harmed the economic performance of the country. Firms' production and thus import fell sharply due to higher energy costs and interruptions within logistic chains. Rising production costs elevated prices and thus demoted consumption. Latvian government attempts to smooth out economic turbulence by giving out subsidies and transfers.
To begin with, Latvia is already suffering from a recession due to the pandemic, problems with the supply of power, and goods imported from Russia. Latvia is a small open economy. This country is a member of the European Union, therefore monetary policies are fully adjusted by the European Central Bank. Thus, the case with the horizontal MP will be considered. Due to high geopolitical uncertainty, investment in Latvia experienced a dramatic decline. People start to reallocate their material resources. As a result, the slope of aggregate demand of Latvia becomes steeper and its value declines. Sales of Latvia falls due to logistic issues and sanctioned commodities. After the further escalation of a political conflict, people start to consume more. Also, many imported goods now suffer from restrictions and embargo. Thus, import of Latvia falls, provoking an increase in aggregate demand. As Latvia is a small open economy, it is not an option to apply interest rate targeting to stabilize the situation, since interest rate is determined by the European Central Bank.
To analyze Latvian economy, we have chosen IS and PBP model in coordinates IY with horizontal MP and BP and the level of interest rate which is exogenously set by the ECB. We also consider AD-AS model. We face the paradox of positive AD slope, however, elaborating on the parameters influencing the real exchange rate, which include domestic price level, and some other assumptions, we resolve this problem, and the detailed explanation of why AD curve is negative you can find in our analytical paper. There are three shocks we want to explain to you. Increased uncertainty in future supplies of energy carriers leads to the rise in fuel prices. Moreover, a large number of logistic chains breaks down, leading to adverse SAS shock. Negative AD shock also appears due to fall of investment, as European Union banned investments in the Russian economy, and fall in consumption due to uncertainty of people in their future. Overall, MPC, MPI, autonomous consumption and investment fall, leading to downward shift of AD curve. Now we are at point B. The second shock is the following. Embargo on fertilizers, timber and coal leads to further decrease in SAS. Moreover, import falls due to increase in inflationary expectations and further sanctions, as well as consumption increases due to irrational consumption. AD curve shifts rightwards due to increase in autonomous consumption and net exports. Now we are at point C. Subsequently, in order to stimulate the economy, the government of Latvia gives transfers to citizens and refugees, leading to increase in transfers. Thus, AD curve shifts rightwards. Now we are at point D.
Now we are going to present you with possible responses to the shocks described. To do this, we will move on to a model of rational inflation expectations, which will allow us to assess how new information will affect the presented models. The first case, which is also the most possible one, is an increase in the target interest rate by the European Central Bank. The interest rate, which is now close to zero, is forecasted to reach 0.75% in December. Here and after, point 2 denotes the position after the initial shocks. Horizontal MP and BP curves rise to the level of the new interest rate. As a result of this change, two components of demand are affected, namely investment and net exports. Decrease in investment in the bottom graph in IY axis corresponds to an upward movement along the IS curve. In the balance of payments, an increase in the interest rate increases the investment attractiveness of Latvian assets
compared to international ones, which causes excess demand for the euro in its appreciation. As a result, Latvian goods become relatively more expensive, and net export falls. Finally, the equilibrium is restored in an even larger recession, but with a lower inflation rate.
Now we will discuss the second case when the European Central Bank decides not to intervene and change its policy so that Latvia's policymakers are then responsible for the regulation of the internal country's economy. First off, Latvia has control over transfers, government spending, and taxes, and its primary purpose is to slow down the inflation rate, which has recently shown figures that highly deviate from the country's usual situation. Our research has shown that the most effective policy is to increase the taxes for the unaffected business sectors, increasing corporate taxation for them, and allocate this additional revenue to the damaged businesses, which is implied in the AD and IS schedules by increased transfers. The additional taxation is represented by the alpha, which already includes the corporate taxation. This combination will eventually rotate the AD and IS schedules around the pi and I axis respectively, due to the fall in the share of profits by the companies related to the increased taxation, and also increase the production level caused by subsidies for businesses and lower inflationary expectations for entrepreneurships, shifting SAS and IS curves to the right and making the inflation rate decrease.
The last case is the end of the quantitative easing policy, which has been in effect in the European Union since 2015. The choice of this policy was due to the liquidity trap in which European countries found themselves. Quantitative easing involves buying bonds from banks, which lowers interest rates. Through its signaling role, it also affects inflationary expectations. The introduction of quantitative tapering, which is the opposite policy, aims for reducing inflationary expectations. As a result, supply is stimulated, which corresponds to its downward shift in the AD/AS model, whereas aggregate expenditure falls. Decreasing inflationary expectations cause a fall in the expected real interest rate, which makes households and investors feel less well off, and leads to a leftward shift in AD and IS. The planned result of this policy is a reduction in inflation rates, which will most likely be supplemented by a fall in the level of output. However, this scenario is based on the assumption that the population trusts the central bank and changes their inflationary expectations relatively quickly, which may not be the case and depends on the credibility of the central bank's policy.
As for the first question, we were suggested to make government spending induced by adding subsidies. We agree with these critics. We introduced corporate taxation but came to a conclusion that it will be harmful to raise the overall corporate taxation. Thus, we increased taxation for firms and entrepreneurships. Then we said that the subsidies are considered transfers for modeling, which made us simply increasing transfers, adding effect to the decrease in AD and increasing SAS by helping production. If we use the induced government, AD will still move down and SAS would increase, leading to the already described shocks, but at the same time making the model more precise in understanding how the subsidies work. As for the drawback, we cannot agree with it because the IS and PBP is crucial to comprehend several details. First off, in the initial shocks we had to explain why the monetary policy is exogenous, thus MP is horizontal, and show the perfect capital mobility for Latvia. Then, while discussing the cases, we could not use only ADAS, as it would be deeply unrepresentative, because the initial decision of the ECB to raise its interest rate must be reflected in this model. Finally, the IS and PBP model made it clear that the economic logic is not disrupted, and, although different shocks change different components of the ADAS model, it is for the IS and PBP to show the consistency between changes in ADAS and IS.
Indeed, in the conventional model, the real exchange rate depends positively on the domestic price level and negatively on the foreign price level. In our model, we use a logarithm approximation of the real exchange rate formula to be able to move from the price level to inflation. This approximation is valid for relatively small price levels, which is not quite our case. However, we needed this transformation not to have AD with negative slope. Otherwise, aggregate demand curve would be vertical, which is due to the lack of independent monetary policy of Latvia and the inability to change the nominal interest rate with inflation changes since it's set exogenously. As for the math part, here we provide a more detailed explanation of the conversion of the price level to inflation. To sum it up, the more expensive our goods are, the more foreign currency must be given in exchange for ours in order to buy them, and correspondingly higher the real exchange rate is.
In conclusion, in the situation when high inflation is combined with a drop in GDP growth rates, a good way would be to stimulate supply through direct subsidies, as in case 2, or to influence inflationary expectations, as in case 3. Case 2, however, seems unlikely to us, since it is considered that the European Central Bank does not intervene. Case 3 is based on the assumption that economic agents are able to evaluate the available information and quickly adjust their inflation expectations. All in all, we recommend that the Latvia government rely on the actions of European Central Bank and expect a rate increase from it. In parallel, a strategic decision is to find new source of energy and metal.